Hamid, welcome to Cassandra.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So, Hamid, you have been looking for several decades into the Middle East, and you know everything that's going on, all the relations, all of the changes. One particular recent change that everyone right now is talking about, and with potentially significant ramifications for several players, not only in the region, but maybe even beyond, is the Saudi Iran agreement. So, before we kind of dive into this, into the solution, into the agreement and what it means, could you just give us a little bit of a background word, like the about Saudi Iran relations, how it kind of, I'm not sure how many decades we have to move, but give us a little bit of background. Where are we coming from?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a deep history, of course, behind the rivalry between these two regional powers. And of course, the 1979 Islamic Revolution was a turning point because before that, basically both Iran and Saudi Arabia were defined within the so-called Western Bloc. Both were the US allies. So the religious differences in terms of Iran being a majority Shia country and Saudi Arabia being basically or claiming to be the leader of the Sunni world, those kinds of things were already there, but strategic considerations, most importantly in terms of their relationship with the US, sort of put them in on the same front. But after the Islamic Revolution, of course, and because of the Islamic Republic's sort of policy of exporting the revolution, not only Saudi Arabia, but basically all those Islamic countries neighboring Iran got worried about the prospects. I mean, that sort of narrative of political Islam that Iran was representing. So that was sort of the beginning of the tensions, the way that we've been witnessing recently. And so there, since then, there have been some sort of on and off in the relationship in terms of, for example, in the 1990s, there was a thaw in relations. At that time, it was late Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani, then president of Iran, who initiated a relationship, better relationship. And, kind of quick flash forward, in 2013, it was just a few months after President Rouhani came to power. So he was the guy who was representing diplomacy. And I mean, diplomacy, normalization with the world, not only with neighbors, but more importantly, actually with the West, as it happened in the nuclear deal, basically. Those were the foundations of his foreign policy. So in that context, he also tried to reach out to Arab countries. And there were already talks between Iran and Kuwait, Iran and Saudi Arabia, others. And so here it's important to consider the factional politics in Iran, because one of the reasons that in 2013 the hardliners attacked the Saudi embassy in Tehran and Saudi consulate in Mashhad, it wasn't all driven by, for example, ideological differences, things like that. It was also about sort of hindering the progress in relationship the way that Rouhani wanted, and basically depriving Rouhani of foreign policy achievements that he could have. And but right before that, we need to also consider that tensions were already on the rise, because in Syria, for example, Iran was siding with the Assad regime. Saudi Arabia was among those who were supporting the opposition. And then after that incident with regard to Saudi diplomatic places, the Yemen war started, and it was basically the Iran-backed Houthis who have been resisting Saudi Arabia. So ideological reasons of the past, strategic reasons of more recent time, all those things, caused a kind of rupture in the relationship as we witnessed. And then it was only since 2-3 years ago, more accurately speaking, 2 years ago, that the two sides started negotiations. The talks were mediated by Baghdad, actually.
Okay.
And so that was why it was a little bit of a surprise that, China came in out of the blue, and, the agreement was basically concluded and announced in China. So it was kind of compact background, if you may say, for what we've been seeing, basically.
Hamid, can we just like outline what this agreement really is? What does it concretely mean? Like, what does it entail? And then maybe secondly, how does it change the status quo, or how might it change the status quo?
So here it is important to note that the details of the agreement as such have not been published, and the two sides have been deliberately trying to keep it confidential. Maybe because, and we know that, there's a 2 months period they have, announced since the signing of the agreement until the commitments are, going to be met by the two sides. So maybe because it's still in a kind of testing phase, the two sides are hesitant to speak about the details, also in order not to sort of give excuse to those parties, domestic and international, who may not want to see the success of the agreement. So this is about the details. But basically what we know is that the two sides have agreed to take into account their security considerations. So first of all, it's important to note that it is essentially a security agreement, because the nature of the concerns, the mutual concerns, have been security, basically. So on the Saudi side, of course, there's this expectation that Iran stops its support for the Houthis and contribute positively to the end of the war in Yemen. And on the Iranian side, of course, there's this, especially over the past few months, since last September, when the nationwide protests started in Iran, the Iranian officials have been accusing the Saudis of supporting, of instigating, basically, unrest, as they say, via their media, etc. So they have been expecting the Saudis to tone down their propaganda against Iran. So these are the things that we know. But also, as we can, for example, understand from what the Iranian and Saudi officials have been saying, it seems that it is at least supposed to go beyond security scope if they are successful in meeting the primary sort of promises, let's say. And that's about economic cooperation, because just the other day, the Saudi finance minister said that there's no obstacle for the Saudis to invest in Iran. And it was, coming from the Saudis after all these years of tensions, it was quite significant to my understanding. And also, there were some unconfirmed reports about the potential establishment of a Chinese mediated or Chinese initiated financial channel between Iran and Arab countries, more specifically the countries of the Arab League, in order to facilitate, because due to sanctions, one of the very serious problems that Iran has had has been to sort of bring money inside the country, and many of its assets and financial resources are frozen in foreign banks. So things like that. It seems to me that the role of China is also sort of bigger than just the mediator, or providing just the venue for the agreement to happen. So this is the outcome.
Maybe we go just from one player to the next. So maybe we start with Saudi Arabia, then move on to Iran. China's obviously involved, but there might be other players that you consider to be involved. Like, what kind of risks and opportunities are there for each? Let's start by Saudi Arabia.
So for Saudi Arabia, of course, it would be a great achievement if Iran actually stops its support for the Houthis, because just imagine what the Saudis expected to be a quick victory in Yemen has taken already years and considerable amount of financial resources, and in the process Saudi Arabia lost the basically Arab consensus, if you may. I mean, it wasn't sort of comprehensive Arab consensus, but the coalition that it had gathered together for the war in Yemen sort of collapsed, and it's only Saudi Arabia and the UAE remained. And among those two actors, there are also differences, and they are pursuing sort of sometimes even competing agendas in Yemen. So in that sense, Saudi Arabia really needs to end the war in Yemen in good terms, of course. And for that reason, Iranian cooperation is essential. Here, I am really doubtful that, at least in the short term, Iran would sort of overhaul its Yemen policy altogether,
Right.
because at the end of the day, it's just the beginning, it's just the first step, and Iran may need the Houthis once again as a leverage over Saudis. So what I would expect is for Iran to halt at least direct support, direct military support in terms of arms shipment, etc., for the Houthis, but political support and also the means of indirect military support, like through Hezbollah, etc., may still remain sort of intact. Waiting for, Iran waiting for future developments to basically reconsider. So this would be the major achievement, and it would also mean important geopolitical and strategic developments in the Middle East, because it would mean the end of one of the most lengthy wars in the Middle East over the past decades. And it would, of course, release Saudi's financial burden in order to, do invest part of the investment. At least the Iranians, I think, would expect to go to Iran. But more broadly, it would positively sort of contribute to those ambitious economic and infrastructural plans that Saudi Arabia has been, thinking about and devising, actually.
And you mentioned already the risks of the Houthi support, which you think will to a certain extent still remain. Do you see any other risks for the Saudi side?
For the Saudi side, it really much depends on the extent to which the agreement is going to remain in place. But apart from Yemen, and I'm emphasizing on Yemen, of course, because it's the single most important regional file that Saudi Arabia has been dealing with. But other than that, we are already witnessing the actually positive implications of this agreement, like in Syria, because just yesterday, March 23, there was this Reuters report that the normalization between Assad regime and Saudi Arabia is rather imminent. And so in that sense, of course, it's already impacting positively Saudi Arabia's regional policy. But of course, one can also argue that, in the broader picture or in the big picture, there might be some longer-term strategic risk for Saudi Arabia in terms of its relationship with the United States, because, going to China for this agreement, it's quite understandable, of course, because, apart from China, I would not imagine any other actor with leverage over Iran to make Iran, agree to the terms of any sort of agreement. So it is understandable, but it also means some sort of revision in Saudi Arabia's foreign policy. So the Saudis are trying, of course, to pursue a balanced foreign policy, to maneuver between the West and the East, if you will. And they have made it clear that closer cooperation with China does not mean excluding the United States, but it might not be exactly the same thing as it is seen in the United States. Just imagine if, for example, Trump comes back to power, or people from the Republican Party who basically have been sort of sensitive to these issues. There might be a new foreign policy thinking in the United States with regard to Saudi Arabia. So the extent to which this kind of balanced foreign policy for Saudi Arabia at the strategic level, at the international level, would be sustainable, that's a matter of time.
It's very interesting that you see this this leaning towards one side, either on the US side or China in this case, to a certain extent at least, is actually even true for Saudi Arabia. Okay, then let's move on to Iran. What do you see as the opportunities, risks, and maybe even incentives?
Yeah, of course, it's better to start with incentives, I think, because the Iranian side has been always emphasizing on this narrative of resistance, as they say, part of which has been sort of this hostile narrative, or at least, stubbornness, I would say, towards countries like Saudi Arabia, who are deemed the U.S. partners, U.S. allies in the region, and as a result, unfriendly countries toward Iran. So what has changed that's caused Iran to come to terms with Saudi Arabia? That's very important, and I see two general categories playing a role here, one domestic, another one external. And the domestic factors have been or are primarily related to the dire economic situation in the country, and the economic and, of course, socio-political crisis that Iran has been struggling with, especially since mid last year, again, with related to the protests. Because on the one hand, the Islamic Republic has lost to a great extent its public legitimacy, and so it's quite obvious in terms of the extent of the protests all over the country, from different social classes, from different ages. I mean, people from different generations, better to say. So in that sense, there is already a socio-political crisis, and that can be deteriorated due to economic factors, because the kind of desire to revive the 2015 nuclear agreement basically failed, partly because of Iran's delay tactics, but also especially after Iran took side with Russia, technically, in the war against Ukraine. The Western side is also not really interested in going ahead with diplomacy as such with Iran. So in that sense, the sense in Iran is that the sanctions are going to remain, at least for the time being. So there might be some alternative. And over the past few weeks, before, better to say, in the weeks prior to the agreement with Saudi Arabia, there was an unprecedented trend in the fall of the value of Iran's currency, for example, and almost all economic indicators have been very negative. So in that sense, Iran has been looking for an alternative in order to at least partly alleviate this economic pressure. And who would be better fitting for this than the rich Arab countries of the Persian Gulf? And of course, if China is also there, even better. So this is part of the calculation. To what extent it's going to be material is a different matter. Maybe we can mention that also down the road. But let me also briefly mention the external factors. The external factors are primarily regional and security in nature. And here I'm talking about specifically about the Abraham Accords. Since 2020, Israel started this process of normalization with Arab countries, first with the UAE and shortly afterwards with Bahrain. And then there has been talks about Israel also normalizing ties with other Arab and Muslim countries. And more recently, especially since Netanyahu came to power again, there was this idea that Saudi Arabia may sooner or later join the Abraham Accords. And this is a game changer because, you know, UAE, Bahrain, others, regardless of, especially in the case of UAE, for example, regardless of the economic power that UAE is already, but in terms of the ideological, political, diplomatic capacities, Saudi Arabia is different. Saudi Arabia is seen as the leader of the Sunni world. So normalizing with Saudi Arabia would mean opening the, and for Israel, of course, opening the door to the Muslim world, basically, the remaining countries. You know, again, back to Iran, there have been, I mean, we've seen this sort of nuclear escalation on the Iranian side, increasing the level of uranium enrichment, etc., etc. And in that sense, the risk of escalation between Israel and Iran has been increasing. In that sense, a coalition between Israel and Arab states would be very detrimental to Iran in the case of a conflict. So Iran wanted to neutralize basically those Arab countries and basically making them neutral. And of course, it is also in the interest of Arab countries as well, because, you know, they don't want to be caught in the crossfire of any confrontation between Iran and Israel. So in that sense, the Israeli factor has played a very important role. So these are basically the main logics, I would say, behind Iran going for a better relationship with Saudi Arabia at this time.